This Air India Airbus A320 was on its way to Mumbai from Calcutta. The aircraft was struggling to climb and was struggling to maintain its speed. The flight crew then realised that they were severely low on fuel and had to divert. To see why this happened and what happens next, stay tuned. This is the story of Air India Flight 676. It was flying from Calcutta to Mumbai on the 22nd of July 2017. There were 2 flight crew on board, 5 cabin crew, and 99 passengers. The pilot in command was a 34-year-old female, and her total flying hours were 5,991, and she would be acting as the pilot flying for this flight. The first officer was a 28-year-old female, and she had a total of 446 flying hours. She would be acting as the pilot monitoring for this flight. Now, this was going to be the second flight for the flight crew that day, as they had previously flown Mumbai to Calcutta, and this was the return leg flying back from Calcutta to Mumbai. The aircraft had a transit check and then was accepted by the pilot, and the passengers were then boarded. The aircraft was fueled with 10.8 tons, and the aircraft was then started up and taxied and then took off from Calcutta at 04:33 UTC. During the departure, the flight crew carried out the mandatory after takeoff checklist and then continued en route to their destination. The flight crew noticed there was some quite severe weather on their flight path, and with approval from Calcutta ATC, they deviated from their flight path just to avoid that weather. As the temperature was quite low and they were flying through icing conditions, they switched on the engine anti-ice and the wing anti-ice systems. It was at this point where the flight crew started to realise they had an issue. The aircraft was struggling to climb, and it was unable to achieve its planned altitude for the en route cruise. In a very slow climb, it managed to reach a maximum altitude of just above 24,000 feet. It was also struggling to reach its planned speed for the cruise as well. The flight crew were struggling to figure out what was causing this issue. There was no warnings or cautions on their ECAM system, and ECAM stands for Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System. Now, this is where it would show the pilots if there was any malfunctions with the aircraft, and it was currently showing that there were no issues, so they were struggling to figure out why the aircraft couldn't climb and why they couldn't increase the speed beyond 230 knots. Once the flight crew were cleared of icing conditions, they then decided to turn off the anti-icing system, hoping that it would improve the performance of the engines. The reason why this could have happened is because the anti-icing systems use bleed air from the engines, so it takes some of that performance away to provide anti-icing for the aircraft. So when they switched it off, the engines would have a slight increase in performance, and hopefully this would have allowed them to climb and to increase their speed. However, this had no effect on the performance of the aircraft. The flight crew then continued their journey, and about an hour into their trip, they realised they were burning much more fuel than expected, and if they were to continue at this rate, they would have insufficient fuel to reach their destination of Mumbai. At this point, the crew had no choice but to divert, and their planned alternate airfield was Bhubaneswar. However, there was heavy rain there, and there was also heavy rain back at Calcutta, so the crew then decided to divert to Nagpur. The crew then got in touch with Calcutta ATC and informed them that they had a suspected fuel leak and were requesting to divert to Nagpur. The crew then received a steer to Nagpur, and once the aircraft was close, they started their approach. The pilot in command then requested the approach checklist and then called for the pilot monitoring to put the gear down. The pilot monitoring then put her hand on the gear lever and realised that it was already in the down position. The crew then realised that the gear had not retracted after takeoff from Calcutta, and the reason why they were having performance issues was because the gear was constantly down and was adding a severe amount of drag to the aircraft. If they had not noticed their fuel burn and had attempted to have flown to Mumbai, they would have run out of fuel before reaching their destination. They then continued their approach to Nagpur and landed safely at 0631 UTC. They landed with just over 3 tons of fuel remaining, but at the fuel burn that they had with the gear down, that amount of fuel would have given them about 20 minutes of flight. After landing, the crew then reported that the reason for their diversion was for insufficient fuel, and a company engineer carried out an inspection for a fuel leak, and there was no fuel leak detected and no abnormality detected in the aircraft. The aircraft was then refueled and released for an onward flight to Mumbai, and the aircraft then landed safely at Mumbai Airport. Now, in the subsequent interview with the crew on how this could have occurred, the pilot in command, the pilot that was flying, remembers asking the pilot monitoring to put the landing gear up. The first officer then puts her hands on the landing gear lever, but it was not selected up for retraction. Then when the after takeoff checklist was requested, which is also supposed to be a challenge and response procedure, this means that the pilot monitoring will call out the check and the pilot flying will respond with where the position of that check is. So for example, with the after takeoff checks, the first one on there is landing gear. The pilot flying will then look at the lever and the indications and say whether the gear is up or down. However, this was missed, and the first officer missed the first 3 of those checks, which was landing gear flaps and packs, and then only checked that the barrow was set correctly before then moving on. There was also a fair amount of poor weather in the area, which they were actively avoiding, which would have taken their focus away from fully understanding and having a complete appreciation for the situational awareness surrounding this issue. It's just extremely lucky that they maintained a fuel monitor and they noticed the trend that the fuel was lower than it should have been, because if they had missed that, the aircraft would have run out of fuel and would have most definitely crashed. Unfortunately, after this incident, both pilots were grounded due to investigation, but that was because neither pilot had reported that they had been flying with the gear extended for the majority of the flight. They simply reported the incident as a fuel issue with the aircraft. In terms of the safety recommendations that came out of this incident, there wasn't much, but it was more confirmation that standard operating procedures were to be followed and checklists were to be completed completely correctly. But what do you guys think? Was it just a small lapse in judgment, or was there enough indications there that the crew should have been aware that there was a bigger issue at play here? It's always interesting to see incidents like this, because what is a fairly minor movement, which is moving a gear lever up and down, can have such a catastrophic effect. And both these pilots had put the gear up and down probably hundreds of times before, and maybe a bit of complacency or distraction had taken away that focus and could have potentially led to the aircraft running out of fuel and crashing into the ground. But please do let me know your thoughts. Also, if you like the video, please do drop a like. And if you're interested in hearing more interesting air crash investigations, just click on this box here. Otherwise, have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next one.